The first thing I noticed wasn't the fence, it was my mailbox. Sounds ridiculous, I know, but when you've lived on the same piece of land for almost 20 years, your eyes catch things before your brain does. I turned off County Road 18, headed up my gravel driveway after a long Monday at work, and something felt wrong immediately. The mailbox looked closer to the truck window. The gravel shoulder seemed narrower. Even the angle of the fence line looked strange, like somebody had taken a ruler to a picture you knew by heart and shifted it just enough to make you uncomfortable. At first I thought maybe I was tired. I'd spent the weekend helping my brother move equipment down in Arkansas and hadn't gotten much sleep. But the farther I drove, the more that uneasy feeling settled into my chest. By the time I parked near my workshop, I already knew something had happened. I just didn't know how bad it was. I started walking the property line, coffee thermos still in my hand, and about 50 yards and I stopped dead. My old fence was gone. Not damaged. Not repaired. Gone. Every cedar post my father and I had set together years ago had been pulled from the ground. The fencing was stacked neatly on my side of the property like a pile of scrap lumber waiting for pickup. In its place stood a brand new fence. Fresh posts. Fresh concrete. Bright pressure-treated boards that practically glowed in the afternoon sun. Somebody hadn't just replaced my fence, they'd moved it. I stood there staring for a good minute before I noticed a plastic sign zip-tied to one of the posts. It was one of those cheap temporary construction notices. Property boundary adjustment completed per development enhancement plan. Development enhancement plan. I remember reading that phrase 3 times because it made absolutely no sense. I didn't live in a development. I lived on 3 acres my family had owned since before half the county was paved. Then it hit me. The subdivision next door. Maple Hollow Estates. The place with the stone entrance, decorative ponds, fancy landscaping, and houses packed so tightly together that neighbors could probably hear each other sneeze through the walls. They'd been expanding for years. Every time I looked over there, another field had disappeared and another row of expensive houses had popped up. I walked the entire fence line before grabbing my survey records from the house. The difference wasn't a few inches. It wasn't a mistake. The new fence sat 6 feet inside my property. 6 feet. Along nearly 500 feet of boundary. That wasn't landscaping. That was land theft with a smile. The next morning I drove straight to the subdivision office. The building looked more like a small bank than an HOA office. Stone facade. Polished glass doors. Flags out front. The kind of place designed to impress people who confuse appearances with authority. Sitting behind a large desk was a man named Bradley Pierce, president of the Homeowners Association. Bradley had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. When I told him why I was there, he leaned back comfortably and folded his hands like we were discussing golf scores. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "we were actually expecting you." That sentence alone told me everything. They knew exactly what they'd done. I asked him why my fence had been moved. He slid a folder across the desk and explained that a recent survey suggested the boundary line was inaccurate and adjustments were necessary to improve the visual continuity of the neighborhood entrance. Visual continuity. That's what he called taking part of somebody else's land. I asked whether it had occurred to anyone to call me first. Bradley shrugged. Actually shrugged. "We assumed you wouldn't object. The change benefits the overall appearance of the community." I remember staring at him for several seconds because I genuinely couldn't believe a grown man had just said that out loud. Then something else occurred to me. Something I hadn't thought about in years. My father used to tell a story about the original developer who built the first phase of Maple Hollow. Back then it was a much smaller neighborhood, and the developer had approached Dad with a request. He wanted to place part of the subdivision entrance monument on the corner of our property because it created a better angle from the highway. Dad had agreed. Not because he had to, but because he was the kind of man who still believed a handshake meant something. No paperwork. No easement. No contract. Just neighborly trust. I left Bradley's office without raising my voice. Didn't threaten him. Didn't argue. Didn't even tell him he was wrong. I simply thanked him for his time and walked back to my truck. As I drove home, I kept seeing that stone entrance in my head. The giant sign. The decorative walls. The lights. The landscaping. The centerpiece of the entire neighborhood. And for the first time in years, I started wondering exactly whose land it was sitting on. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't angry anymore. Angry people make mistakes. I was curious. And sometimes curiosity is a whole lot more dangerous. The next morning, I was sitting outside the county records office 10 minutes before they unlocked the doors. I wasn't there looking for revenge, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I wanted facts. My father used to say that when somebody is acting overly confident, there's usually a document somewhere they hope you'll never read. As it turned out, he was right. I spent most of the morning digging through property records, old plats, archived surveys, and easement filings. The woman helping me at the records desk was probably in her 60s and knew more about local land history than anybody I'd ever met. Around lunchtime, she looked over her glasses and said, "You're talking about Maple Hollow, aren't you?" I laughed and asked how she knew. She smiled. "Because you're the third person this year who's come in asking questions about that subdivision." That got my attention. Apparently, the development had a history of pushing boundaries, sometimes literally. Small disputes, fence lines, drainage easements, access roads. Nothing major enough to make headlines, but enough to leave a trail of frustrated property owners behind. Then she handed me the document that changed everything. It was an original plat overlay showing the exact corner where the subdivision entrance sat. I spread it across the table and felt my pulse pick up. The entrance wasn't partially on my property. It wasn't mostly on my property. The entire decorative monument section sat inside my boundary line. The stone walls, the waterfall feature, the lighting system, every bit of it. I checked again because it seemed impossible. Then I checked a third time. Same result. Next came the easement records. There weren't any. No permanent easement. No temporary easement. No lease agreement. No access rights. Nothing. Legally speaking, the HOA's crown jewel was sitting on land they didn't own and never officially obtained permission to use. Dad's handshake agreement had survived only because nobody had ever challenged it. Well, that was about to change. I drove home carrying copies of everything. That evening I sat at my kitchen table where my father used to drink coffee after long days in the field. His old photograph still hung on the wall across from me. In the picture he's standing beside the original fence we built together, dirt on his jeans, hammer in one hand, grinning like the world made sense. I stared at that photo for a while. Then I looked down at the survey maps. That's when I realized this wasn't really about 6 feet of land. It was about respect. They hadn't made a mistake. They hadn't knocked on my door and asked permission. They had looked at my property, looked at me, and decided I didn't matter. Once that thought settled in my head, the decision became easy. By noon the following day, my attorney had prepared a formal revocation notice terminating any permissive use of my property by the subdivision. Every requirement was followed. Every deadline was documented. Every letter was delivered correctly. Nobody could claim they hadn't been warned. 3 days later, I hired a contractor. The owner was an old friend named Carl Bennett. Carl listened quietly while I explained the situation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked, "You sure about this?" I nodded. Completely. He chuckled. "This is going to make some people very unhappy." "Funny," I said. I was thinking the same thing. Monday morning arrived bright and clear. Around 7 o'clock, the first trucks rolled in. Excavators, flatbeds, work crews. Everything perfectly legal. Everything perfectly documented. The workers weren't touching a single house. They weren't damaging roads. They weren't interfering with utility lines. They were simply removing structures that sat on private property without authorization. By 8 o'clock, residents were gathering along the sidewalks, watching in confusion. By 9 o'clock, confusion had turned into panic. The giant stone sign came down first, then the decorative walls, then the lighting system, then the waterfall. Piece by piece, the entire entrance disappeared. It was honestly impressive how quickly years of landscaping prestige could vanish when ownership documents entered the conversation. Around 10:30, a black SUV came flying into the construction area. The driver's door opened before the vehicle fully stopped. Out jumped Bradley Pierce. Even from 50 yards away, I could tell he was furious. He marched directly toward me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted. I handed him a copy of the survey map. "Protecting my property." He looked at the documents without really reading them. "You can't remove our entrance." "Apparently I can. That's community property." "No," I said calmly. "Community property would belong to the community. This belongs to me." His face turned red. "You're destroying millions in property value." I shrugged. Interesting concern. I had similar concerns when somebody moved my fence. For a second I thought he might actually explode. Instead, he pointed toward the construction crews and said, This isn't over. I remember smiling. Actually, Bradley, this is just getting started. By late afternoon, the entrance was gone. What remained was a wide opening connected directly to the county road. No sign, no monument, no decorative barriers. Nothing that distinguished Maple Hollow from any other street in America. The effect was immediate. Within days, delivery drivers started using the roads as shortcuts. GPS applications adjusted routes. Random vehicles cut through the neighborhood. Residents complained about increased traffic. Security concerns spread quickly. The irony was almost poetic. The same people who had taken 6 feet of my land because they wanted better visual appeal were now discovering how much they depended on property rights themselves. The HOA board called emergency meetings. Residents packed the clubhouse. Some blamed me. Others blamed Bradley. The more information surfaced, the uglier things became for the HOA leadership. Several homeowners learned for the first time that the entrance wasn't actually on subdivision property. Others discovered that the fence relocation had never been approved by a full board vote. Questions started flying. Who authorized the survey? Who approved construction? Why wasn't legal counsel consulted? Why hadn't anyone verified ownership before spending community funds? Those questions grew louder every week. Then came the letters. First, they offered to move my fence back. I declined. Then they offered compensation. I declined again. That surprised people, but money was never the point. If I'd accepted a check immediately, the lesson would have been forgotten within months. Instead, I waited. Pressure continued building inside the neighborhood. Homeowners demanded answers. Real estate agents complained. Prospective buyers asked why the subdivision no longer had a formal entrance. Bradley's position became increasingly uncomfortable. One evening, I was repairing a mower deck in my workshop when a pickup truck pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man named Richard Holloway, one of the original residents. I'd met him a few times over the years. Good guy, retired firefighter, the kind of person who still waved at strangers. We sat outside drinking coffee while the sun went down. After a while, he sighed and said, "You know, most of us never wanted any of this." I believed him. That's the thing about HOA stories. The loudest people usually aren't the majority. They're just the ones who grab the microphone. Richard explained that many residents were angry at the board, not at me. They felt misled, embarrassed, trapped in a situation they hadn't created. That conversation stuck with me. It reminded me that communities are made of individuals, and individuals aren't always responsible for the mistakes of their leaders. A few days later, my attorney called. The HOA wanted to negotiate. Not argue. Not threaten. Negotiate. For the first time since this whole mess started, they were ready to sit down as equals. I looked out my workshop window toward the empty space where their grand entrance used to stand and realized something important. They had finally learned the difference between asking and taking. The question now was whether that lesson had come too late. A week later, we met in a conference room at a local attorney's office, and the difference in the atmosphere was impossible to miss. The first time I dealt with the HOA, they sat behind desks and spoke like people giving instructions. This time they sat across from me with folders, legal pads, and expressions that suggested reality had finally introduced itself. Bradley was there too, though he looked a lot different than he had the day he smiled and told me they assumed I wouldn't mind losing part of my land. The confidence was gone. The little smirk was gone. In its place was a man who had spent several weeks explaining difficult answers to angry homeowners. Their attorney started the meeting by acknowledging that mistakes had been made. That's lawyer language for somebody messed up badly. They offered a permanent easement agreement for the entrance area, monthly compensation for the use of my land, reimbursement for every expense connected to the fence relocation, payment for the new survey work, and a written legal acknowledgement confirming the original boundary line exactly as it had always existed. I listened quietly. Then I asked for one additional condition. I wanted the agreement recorded permanently with the county so no future board could pretend the conversation never happened. After a brief discussion, they agreed. Just like that. The same people who had moved my fence without asking were now signing documents, making sure they could never do it again. A month later, crews returned. This time, they weren't stealing land. They were restoring it. My fence was rebuilt exactly where it belonged. Stronger posts, better materials, straight as an arrow. When the work was finished, I walked the property line one evening, carrying the same old thermos I'd had the day this started. The sun was setting over the fields, painting everything gold. I stopped beside one of the new fence posts and ran my hand across the wood. Sounds silly, maybe, but I felt something close to peace. Not because I'd won. Not because the HOA lost. Because the truth had finally ended up where it belonged. The subdivision eventually rebuilt its entrance too. Smaller this time. Simpler. No oversized monument. No elaborate waterfall. Just a tasteful sign and landscaping that fit comfortably inside the legal easement they now paid to use. Every time I drive past it, I can't help smiling a little. Not out of spite. Well, maybe a tiny bit out of spite. But mostly because it serves as a reminder that property lines matter, agreements matter, and respect matters even more. What's funny is that the story spread around the county faster than I ever expected. People I'd never met would stop me at gas stations or hardware stores and ask if I was the fence guy. Some thought I was a hero. Some thought I went too far. A few believed I should have accepted the first apology and moved on. Maybe they're right. I've thought about that more than once. Because here's the part people don't always talk about. Every conflict leaves scars. The HOA president eventually resigned. Homeowners spent money fixing a problem that never should have existed. Friendships inside the neighborhood got strained. Trust disappeared for a while. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if somebody had simply knocked on my door before touching that fence. One conversation. One honest request. Maybe none of this ever happens. Then again, maybe that's the lesson. Too many people mistake politeness for weakness. They assume the quiet guy with a workshop and a tractor won't push back. They assume ownership only matters when it's their ownership. They assume rules apply differently when they have a title, a committee, or a fancy sign out front. Most of the time those assumptions survive because nobody challenges them. This time somebody did. And if I'm being completely honest, the most satisfying moment wasn't watching the entrance come down. It wasn't signing the final agreement. It wasn't even seeing my fence restored. It was the day Richard, the retired firefighter, stopped by again. We were standing near the property line when he looked over at the rebuilt entrance and laughed. "You know," he said, "the neighborhood actually looks better now." I asked him why. He pointed toward the sign and shrugged. "Because now it's honest." We stood there for a second looking at it. Then we both laughed. Maybe he was right. Maybe honest things always look better in the end. But I'll leave that for you to decide. So here's my question for everyone watching. If a neighbor or an HOA moved your fence 6 feet onto your land without permission, would you have done what I did? Would you have removed the entrance, forced the issue, and demanded legal accountability? Or would you have accepted an apology and settled it quietly? Let me know down in the comments because people are surprisingly divided on this one. Some say it was justice. Others say it was revenge. And honestly, after everything that happened, I'm still not sure where the line between those two things really is. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes property rights are just a technicality. Sometimes 6 feet of land is a lot more than 6 feet. Sometimes it's a matter of principle.